Welcome to Our World with Black Enterprise. I'm your host, Marc Lamont Hill. On this special episode, we're taking on the current political climate and how it's impacting our communities.
The death of bin Laden marks the most significant achievement to date in our nation's effort to defeat al-Qaeda.
That's what's going on in our world, starting now. Joining me to discuss the rapidly shifting political tides and how it might impact you are Marc Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League, Dr. Imani Perry, Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of the new book, More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States, and David Webb, co-founder of the Tea Party 365. Thank you all for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Great to be with you. Great.
This is such an interesting moment, right? I mean, we are just a little bit beyond this historical moment where Barack Obama comes on television and announces that Osama bin Laden has been killed.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.
I saw celebration in the streets. I saw Democrats and Republicans all in agreement. Does this signify a new political moment?
Well, Obama got Osama, and what it does is it's a bit of a return to what the mood of the country was after 9/11, when I think there was a unifying sense and a unifying force, that the tragedy created that. And there's a bit of closure, particularly for the 9/11 families with Osama bin Laden being killed by those Navy SEALs over in Pakistan. So I do think the question is, how long will it last? And will it be only momentary, or is it a sense that the nation is better off if we're unified in purpose?
David, I mean, you are a conservative. I mean, I haven't heard a conservative yet deny that this was the right mission. Are there any critiques of this, of Obama's approach?
Look, it's a unifying thing. I agree with you, but look, there are issues that are outside of race, outside of politics. Osama bin Laden's a murderer, a mass murderer who's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands across the world and thousands of Americans. I don't think you'll find any rational person saying this was not the right thing to do.
So, Imani, you look like you want to jump in. I see you chopping a bit already. Please.
Right. This is a unifying moment. I think it does provide some closure, but I am concerned that there may be a revival of some of the kind of Islamophobia and hostility towards to the Muslim world, towards the Arab world that we saw in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And so in this moment, I keep hoping that people remember the kind of the wave of revolutions that we saw in the Middle East and Africa, and how we identified with people in that moment, and the sort of universal desires for freedom and equality that we saw that exist across borders, that transformed our image of people in that part of the world. And so in the midst of that, I want us to keep that vision of the Middle East in mind.
I guess that's what worries me sometimes. When we close ranks around something as a nation, sometimes we do that at the exclusion of somebody we consider the other, whether it's an Arab, whether it's a Muslim, whether it's a Mexican immigrant. I mean, sometimes our fears and the things that bring us together are very dangerous. No, David?
Yeah, I understand, and I agree with that. But in this case, and I have followed the news reports very closely on this, I have yet to see any backlash against Muslims. I mean, both Presidents Obama and Bush made it clear this was not a war on Islam. That, as a matter of fact, both have made statements to the fact that Osama bin Laden does not reflect the Muslim faith, but is an aberration, which is what he is, or was.
But I think it's also got to be said, and you know, these are not moments when we should rush to engage in hard political analysis. But I do think that this demonstrated a quality about President Obama. In effect, he spoke or walked softly, and he carried a big stick. This operation was in the planning stages for months and months and months. But at the end of the day, the person that had to make the decision to sign the order was Barack Obama. And so I want to certainly give the president credit for a great sense of determination and the way, indeed, in which it was handled. And I don't think that ought to dominate the discussion, but it certainly has to be said, because many people questioned whether the president had the determination to make these sort of calls. I think he's demonstrated that not only he did, but he succeeded. Let's remember, Jimmy Carter sought an intervention to free the hostages. It did not work. Ronald Reagan sought a missile strike to take out Gaddafi many years ago. Bill Clinton had an unsuccessful intervention at the Branch Davidian compound. Barack Obama has succeeded in undertaking a highly risky but very important effort.
Shortly after taking office, I directed Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, to make the killing or capture of bin Laden the top priority of our war against al-Qaeda, even as we continued our broader efforts to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat his network.
What he basically did is he answered the question, and the question has been answered, and the debate should be over.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Imani Perry, Marc Morial, and David Webb. We're talking about these policy issues around foreign policy, around Afghanistan, around Osama bin Laden in particular. I want to shift gears a little bit, but David, you had a comment you wanted to make first.
I want to add something to what Marc said. I mean, I understand, and there are the political credits that's due to the president. After all, the decision is his. But this has been an ongoing professional process, and whether it was Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Reagan, Bush, or whatever, all presidents have to deal with the process that happens to take an action. It's not just he gets the credit or the blame for the success or the failure, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that there are professionals that have spent almost a decade tracking Osama bin Laden.
I think one of the challenges, though, is that people have accused Obama of not having been aggressive enough on terror, that he wasn't following the Bush plan, which is
well, most of his policies have followed exactly what came out of the Bush administration with the war on terror. He's following wartime policy, which comes from the professionals.
Does that frustrate you at all, Marc?
No, the president is doing what he said he would do. He always supported the war in Afghanistan. He said as a candidate that he would double up, redouble our efforts, win the war in Afghanistan, and that he would get Osama bin Laden. He took a different tack in Iraq, where he said, I disagree with the Iraq war, and I'm going to wind us down out of that war. You know, it's important to analyze this in a promises made, promises kept analysis. And I sort of look at what the president has undertaken as just fulfilling what he said he would do as a candidate.
But Marc, you need to be accurate about this, though, because the plan was the plan to wind down the Iraq war was negotiated between Joseph Brennan and Nouri al-Maliki during the Bush administration. This is the problem I have with separating just pure politics.
Give George Bush some credit.
No, this isn't about giving credit. This is about.
You fight to make sure George Bush gets that.
But this is about being accurate. This plan was in place before Barack Obama was president. It was part of the military decision, and this is why I said we cannot just include political without including the process.
But I'm not going to let you sit here. I'm not going to let you sit here and diminish the president's contribution.
I'm not trying to diminish it. I'm adding to the fact that it needs to be fully correct.
Let the professionals, there's no doubt that the military, but under the Constitution, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. And so he has to make the ultimate decisions. And so I, will offer credit, but what this is really all about is too many people sought to diminish Barack Obama's foreign policy credentials, sought to diminish whether he was committed to taking out Osama bin Laden. So what he basically did is he answered the question, and the question has been answered, and the debate should be over.
Huh. Well, this part of the conversation is certainly over, because I have to change gears just a little bit. One of the things Marc mentioned earlier was this idea of promises kept, right? That Obama's made certain promises and then he's kept them. Imani, my concern, and the concern of many people, is that he hasn't made so many promises to black people. What do you say to that?
Let me say this. I don't take the position that President Obama has particular responsibilities to the black community because he's black. I think he has his particular responsibilities exist because we voted for him in overwhelming numbers. And the reality is that we have crises in black America that are unprecedented at the moment. Crises in terms of education, crises in terms of health care, imprisonment, on and on, employment, right? And so we do need those crises addressed in particular fashion, not just by the president, by Congress, by our local and state governments. I mean, it's a multi-tier critique, and we have to be organized in order to get that kind of response, right? So yes, I do have that critique of the president, but not exclusively.
Okay,
every president has a responsibility to the citizenry of this nation, and I think particularly the most vulnerable citizens. So I give the president credit. He has stepped up enforcement of civil rights laws. He's made a lot of important appointments to the courts. His economic policies helped, I think, to get the nation out of a ditch. But there's the unfinished business of more targeted focus on those areas where the unemployment rate is the highest. So my encouragement to the president has been to articulate an urban policy, to articulate a policy that is more focused on those areas.
An urban policy.
An urban policy.
That's an interesting idea, and I want to push back to you, Imani, before I go to you, David. This idea of an urban policy still seems like he can't say our names. Even President Clinton, even George Bush could say, I have an agenda for black people. They've had agendas for middle-class people. They've had agendas for gay, lesbian brothers and sisters, for Jewish brothers and sisters. But for some reason, when it comes to black folk, this president, as a black president, doesn't seem to say our name. Why is that?
I don't know why that is, but it is the case that there are race-specific issues. It's not simply that, it's not simply that black people are disproportionately poor, although we are, but even if you control for class, the discrimination that African Americans experience is greater in consumer purchases, in health care, in education. I mean, in every area, we have evidence that shows that there is active discrimination even when circumstances are identical.
Now, Imani, some of the issues that we talk about are economic and their job-related issues, in particular, education, housing, and so forth. There are some issues around racism structurally in society, and some of them you talk about in your book that are beyond just pure one white person hating a black person. There's deeper societal issues and ways of thinking with it.
What we see, because we see that people practice racial inequality, that's the language I use. I don't use the term racism, but we see that people disadvantage on the basis of race in employment, in housing, in health care, in education. So it's not simply that because black people are more likely to be poor, more likely to be in areas of concentrated poverty, that we get limited access, but that actually people disadvantage. When you go to the doctor, you're less likely to get necessary tests if you're black, right? Things like that. So we need to have some kind of policy initiatives that begin to help us control our practices in society so that black people are not systematically
Now, is that a civil rights
disadvantaged.
issue? How do we enforce it? How do we create a context where people can go to the doctor and get all the necessary tests, or that someone can get the proper medicine?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, one of the things that they have attempted to do in medicine, and people do in various fields, is to figure out how to address standards of care so that there's not a lot of discretion that allows people to disadvantage on the basis of race, right? So that there are just norms that you have to follow through and that you can't. So some of it is just controlling processes. We also know that the more people know that something is a source of racial inequality, the better they actually are at controlling it. So we do better when we talk about race. People have this fiction that we do worse when we talk about. We do better. Race matters in every single one of these arenas, every arena in which we live.
What do you say? Does race matter in every arena?
Race will always be a factor in some way, ethnicity, if you will. Where I find agreement with all of you, especially, is in the fact that we need to focus on poor, wealth growth. The perception in this country is that if you say, are there more poor black people than anybody else in this country? Yes, there are. Wrong. We're 12% of the population. There are more poor white people. So focuses should be on economic opportunity and economic growth. Now, within the black community, one of the failures in the black community has been its own empowerment, its own self-empowerment, and taking advantage of what's available to it. You're not going to get 400 years of reversal immediately in decades because you don't have the basis from whether it's industrialization or financial basis for it. But it's time to take care of your own empowerment. And as for the point of why the president can't say black, my thought is that he doesn't want to be perceived as playing only to black people, because that's political suicide, because then your detractors will go after you. Sadly, politics plays into it. We see political calculus instead of economic math.
Hang right there. I actually have to pause you right there. We have to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk about this big birth certificate controversy. What does all that mean? Stay right there. We'll be back with Our World with Black Enterprise.
Even when you're the president of the United States, right, you still experience this kind of questioning.